You started. That's the part they never talk about. You actually started. You made the plan, set the goal, felt the fire in your chest, and you moved. You did the thing. For a week, maybe two, maybe even a month if you were running hot. And then something happened. Not a disaster, not a failure, nothing dramatic enough to explain what followed. The fire just lowered. The alarm started feeling negotiable. The plan started feeling optional. And somewhere in that quiet retreat, you told yourself it was temporary, a small dip, a recovery period, a reset before the next push. But the next push didn't come the way the first one did. And now you're looking at the thing you started, the gym routine, the savings goal, the business idea, the creative project, and it's half built and dusty. You haven't quit, officially. You just haven't continued, effectively. And the distance between where you are and where you were going has become a weight you carry quietly. Here's what nobody told you about that feeling. It's not a motivation problem. Calling it a motivation problem is like calling a broken leg a walking problem. Technically accurate, completely useless, because if you knew how to get the motivation back, it wouldn't be a problem. The fact that you can't just summon it on demand, that it arrived like weather and left the same way, that's exactly the thing that needs to be understood. And the people selling you motivation, the 3-minute speeches, the dramatic music, the let's get it energy, they're not wrong that something needs to change. They're wrong about what that something is. Because the problem isn't that you don't want it enough. The problem is that you've been building on sand. And you can want something desperately, work for it sincerely, feel it completely and still watch it fall. Not because desire isn't real, because desire was never the foundation. It was the weather, beautiful when it appeared, impossible to hold. So what is the foundation? That's the question underneath everything you've been struggling with. And the answer is going to make you uncomfortable before it makes you free. Let's name the enemy precisely. Not laziness, not weakness, not lack of discipline, though your inner critic will insist on all three of those when things fall apart. The actual enemy has a name that almost no one uses in conversations about personal growth, even though it sits at the center of every cycle of effort and collapse you've ever run. The enemy is called motivational dependency. It sounds clinical. It's not. It's the invisible operating system running beneath every ambitious person who keeps starting over. Motivational dependency is the belief, usually unconscious, always automatic, that sustained action requires sustained feeling. That to keep going, you need to keep wanting it in a specific emotional way. That the feeling of drive is not just a nice to have, but a structural requirement. That when the feeling fades, the behavior should fade with it. This belief is so deeply embedded in how most people operate that it doesn't feel like a belief. It feels like a fact. Of course, you need to feel motivated to do hard things. What else would drive you? And so when the feeling lowers, you instinctively wait for it to return before you push again. You consume content to reignite it. You look for a new angle, a new framework, a new story about yourself. You're not quitting, you're refueling, you're being patient with yourself. You're doing what everyone in your life has told you is healthy and sustainable. And you're also staying stuck. Here's what motivational dependency actually does to a person over time. First, it makes your results dependent on conditions you cannot control. Motivation is generated by a cocktail of neurochemistry, sleep quality, social context, recent wins or losses, physical health, and dozens of other variables that have nothing to do with your goals. To make your behavior contingent on that cocktail is to hand the steering wheel to randomness. You end up working hard when conditions conspire to make you feel like working hard and coasting when they don't. And conditions, being what they are, cooperate far less often than ambition requires. Second, motivational dependency is self-eroding. Every time the feeling fades and the behavior fades with it, you add a new entry to the internal ledger your brain keeps about who you are. Each entry reads, "This person stops when it gets hard." Enough entries and the ledger stops being a record of past behavior. It becomes a prediction, a settled conclusion. The brain is a prediction machine, and when it has enough historical data, It stops evaluating each situation individually and starts defaulting to the prediction. The prediction by now might be, I am someone who starts things and doesn't finish them. And here's the third and cruelest effect of motivational dependency. It makes the emotion of starting feel increasingly dangerous, because on some level the part of your brain keeping the ledger knows what happened last time and the time before that. It knows the pattern, and it has started to associate the feeling of excitement and motivation with the coming pain of losing it. So, a new idea arrives, and instead of the clean, pure rush of beginning you felt years ago, it comes with a shadow, a quiet, preemptive grief, a low-frequency warning that this too is probably going to fade, that the person reading this has a history that makes enthusiasm complicated. That shadow is not pessimism, it's pattern recognition, and it will continue to be accurate until you replace the foundation. But here's the thing about motivational dependency that makes it nearly impossible to escape using standard self-help logic. You can't think your way out of it. You can't reason with your nervous system. You can't look at the pattern and decide to stop having it. The pattern was built through experience, and it will only change through a different kind of experience. One that creates new data for the ledger. One that produces a new prediction. Which means the exit is not through more information, better strategy, or deeper understanding. The exit is through something small enough to actually do today. But we'll get to that. Let me tell you about your 11 p.m. version. This is the version of you that exists after a full day of existing. After the work, the obligations, the noise, the performance of being a functional person in the world. The version of you that collapses onto a couch or a bed and feels the full weight of the gap between who you are and who you're trying to become. At 11 p.m., the thoughts don't have the clean structure of goals and plans. They're messier than that. I keep saying this matters to me, but if it actually mattered, wouldn't I be doing it? Other people do it. People with harder lives, worse circumstances, more obstacles, they figure it out. So maybe the issue is me. Maybe I just don't have whatever the thing is that makes a person actually follow through. Maybe the problem isn't the strategy, it's the person using the strategy. And then the negotiation begins. You tell yourself you'll start fresh tomorrow. Not in a hopeful way, in the specific, tired way of someone who has made that deal before and knows the odds, but doesn't have the energy to confront the truth right now. Tomorrow is a currency you've been borrowing from for months. Maybe years. The account is overdrawn, but the limit keeps extending. And then there's the deeper current running beneath all of it. The fear that you're going to hit 40 or 50, looking at the same gap. That the life you imagined isn't a matter of timing, but of fundamental suitability. That the people who achieve what you want to achieve are just wired differently, and no amount of technique or strategy or willpower is going to rewire you. That fear doesn't get spoken out loud. You won't find it in a YouTube comment or a forum post. It lives in the silence right before sleep, and it's doing more damage to your trajectory than any external obstacle you'll ever face. Now let's trace the cycle, because you need to see the whole architecture of the trap before we can talk about escaping it. It starts with a spark, an idea, a vision, a conversation that lights something up. The spark produces motivation. Motivation produces a plan. The plan feels good, detailed, structured, achievable. You feel like this version of the plan is different from the last one because you've learned from before. You've thought of the obstacles. You've prepared. You start. The first days or weeks have their own momentum. The novelty of the behavior releases enough neurochemical reward to sustain itself. You feel the identity shift beginning. You're becoming the person who does this thing. It feels earned early. Then the novelty wears off. The behavior becomes familiar. The brain, which rewarded novelty, stops releasing the same signal. The work feels like work now, rather than transformation. The results are real, but too slow for the emotional reward they're generating. You're doing the thing, but you don't feel like you're becoming someone different anymore. You feel like you're just doing a thing. So the effort gets harder to justify moment to moment. You start negotiating with small decisions. One skipped day, one deferred task, one compromise that doesn't feel significant because the larger commitment is still technically intact, but small decisions compound. One skipped day becomes a pattern. The deferred task becomes the default. The compromise becomes the new baseline. And without a single dramatic decision to quit, you have quietly returned to where you started. Then comes self-blame. And self-blame is the most expensive part of the whole cycle because it depletes the exact emotional resource self-efficacy that you need to try again with full commitment. You enter the next attempt carrying a deficit. You start with less than you started with before. Not less strategy, not less information, less belief in your own capacity to see it through. And so the next attempt, which you make with genuine intention, starts already behind, already quieter, already braced. This is the cycle. And it doesn't break with motivation. It doesn't break with better planning. It doesn't break with more information about why it matters. It breaks with a principle that Hill understood, and almost nobody in modern personal development actually teaches. Let's start the demolition. Because before we can talk about what works, we need to completely dismantle the infrastructure of what doesn't. Not because you haven't heard this before, but because you haven't heard it taken apart with the specificity it deserves. The first false solution is motivational content. Every video you've watched at 11 p.m. trying to get the feeling back, every speech that made the hair on your arm stand up, every story about someone who had nothing and built everything and now wants to tell you that you can too. Here's the structural problem. Motivational content activates the reward circuitry of your brain without requiring any behavioral output. You watch the video, you feel inspired. Your brain releases a mild neurochemical response, something close to what it would release if you had actually done the work. And having felt that response, the urgency to actually produce it through behavior decreases. Motivational content is functionally a substitute for action. It feels like preparation. It feels like forward motion. It produces none of the behavioral evidence that your brain's prediction system requires to actually update its model of you. You can watch 1,000 videos about becoming disciplined. Not one of them will make you more disciplined. Only discipline makes you more disciplined. And discipline, as we'll see, is not what most people think it is. The second false solution is detailed planning. There is a specific kind of person, and you may be this person who responds to the collapse of motivation by planning harder, by going back to the system, redesigning the architecture, adding more detail, more specificity, more accountability structures, as if the reason the last attempt failed was insufficient granularity. Planning releases its own neurochemical reward. The sense of control, the feeling of having thought through the variables, the clarity of a well-designed system, these feel productive. They are not productivity. They are the performance of productivity in the absence of the real thing. And the plan itself becomes the problem, because the more elaborate the plan, the more fragile it is. A complex system has more points of failure. One disruption to a tightly planned schedule and the whole structure feels compromised. And a compromised structure is easier to abandon than a simple one. The third false solution is the accountability partner. The idea that external social pressure, telling someone your goal, checking in weekly, having consequences for failure, will sustain behavior when internal drive cannot. This works for a while, until the accountability relationship itself becomes something you manage rather than something that helps you. Until you're performing discipline for the partner rather than building it for yourself. Until the day you decide, consciously or not, that their judgment is something you can handle, and the behavior stops again. External accountability is a scaffold. Scaffolds are for construction. You cannot build a permanent structure out of scaffolding. At some point, the building needs to hold itself up. The fourth false solution is the identity declaration. I'm not someone who misses workouts. I'm a saver, not a spender. I'm a person who finishes what they start. Said in the mirror, written in the journal, spoken out loud to yourself as if repetition will make it true, as if the statement will reorganize behavior without the behavior reorganizing it first. This is backward. Identity is not the input, identity is the output. You do not declare yourself into a new identity and then act accordingly. You act and act and act, and the accumulated evidence of those actions builds the identity. The declaration can come later as a recognition, as a conclusion, not as an assumption. Every false solution has the same fatal flaw. It tries to generate the feeling of transformation without producing the behavioral evidence that creates actual transformation. None of them work because none of them address what actually breaks the cycle. So if sustained feeling won't carry you, and external pressure won't carry you, and declarations won't carry you, what will? Here is the shift. And it's going to sound too small for the size of the problem you've been living with. That mismatch is intentional, because the reason you've been stuck is partly that you've been looking for a solution proportional to your pain, something big enough to match the weight of the gap, something dramatic enough to justify the years. The solution is not dramatic, but it is irreversible. And irreversible is worth more than dramatic every single time. Hill understood something about human achievement that he didn't always name plainly, but that runs through everything he studied. The architecture of success is not built from above, it's built from below. It doesn't start with vision and descend into behavior. It starts with behavior and ascends into identity. Every person who has ever built something real, a body, a business, a body of creative work, a financial foundation, did it the same way, not with more motivation than you have, with a different relationship to small actions. They understood subconsciously, most intuitively, that a small action done consistently is not a small thing. It is the fundamental unit of identity change. It is the vote in the ledger. It is the evidence the brain's prediction system uses to update its model of who you are and what you're capable of. Not the action you'll do when you feel ready. The action you do before you feel ready, while the feeling is absent, while the doubt is present, while the gap between where you are and where you want to be is so wide that a single small action seems mathematically irrelevant. That action, the small one, the unsexy one, the one that generates no external applause and no visible progress on any scoreboard, is the most important thing you can do. Not because of what it produces directly, because of what it proves to the one system that runs your entire life. It proves that you are not at the mercy of your mood. And that proof, accumulated over time, creates something that no motivation speech, no detailed plan, no accountability partner has ever created for you. It creates behavioral autonomy, the experience of yourself as someone who acts from decision rather than feeling. And from that experience, slowly, quietly, without fanfare, grows the only kind of confidence that doesn't collapse when conditions change. Tell me in the comments, what's the one small action you've been waiting to feel ready for? The one you've been rescheduling for weeks? The version so small it almost embarrasses you to admit it hasn't happened yet. Write it down. Not for me, because your brain needs to see it named. Here are the principles, not as steps, as a system that functions together or not at all. The first is what we might call the minimum viable action. Most people, when they return to a goal after a period of drift, try to re-enter at the level they left or higher to make up for lost time. This is the most expensive mistake in all of personal development. And it happens because of pride, because of the felt need to signal to yourself that you're serious, because the gap between where you were and where you should be demands a response proportional to its size. But the nervous system doesn't care about your pride. It only cares about what's sustainable. When you re-enter too high, the behavior is too costly, too uncomfortable, too far from the current baseline. The brain, which wants to protect its resources, finds reasons to reduce the burden. One compromise leads to another. The compromise becomes the new behavior. You've drifted again, faster than last time. And now the ledger has another entry. The minimum viable action is the smallest version of the behavior that still counts, not the version that impresses anyone. The version that can be done every single day, regardless of mood, schedule, energy level, or life circumstance. The version so small that skipping it would require a specific decision to not do it, rather than a specific decision to do it. 5 minutes of the project, 1 page of the book you're writing, 1 transfer of $20, 1 set in the gym when you have no time for a full workout. Not because 5 minutes changes everything. Because doing 5 minutes when you feel nothing is the exact behavioral evidence your brain needs to update the prediction. This person acts when they don't feel like it. 1 vote. Small vote. But it's in the other ledger now. And here's what happens when the minimum viable action becomes consistent when it happens every day for 2 weeks, 3 weeks, a month. The brain, which updated its prediction based on the evidence, starts generating a new automatic response. Not motivation exactly, something quieter and more reliable. Orientation, a default lean toward the behavior. A mild discomfort when the behavior is skipped rather than a mild relief. That orientation is not willpower. It is the early formation of identity-level behavior. It is the foundation being laid. But minimum viable action has a specific failure mode that will arrive predictably, and you need to know it in advance. At some point, the minimum will feel too small. You'll have the energy and the time, and the feeling will actually be there, and 5 minutes will feel like an insult to your capacity. The temptation to immediately scale up will be enormous. Resist it. Not forever, but longer than feels comfortable, because the minimum viable action is not primarily about output. It is about reliability. And reliability established at the small level transfers to the larger level. Reliability rushed at the larger level, before the behavioral foundation is solid, collapses the entire structure. The minimum holds the foundation in place while the second principle starts to work. The second principle is evidence banking. This is one of the least taught and most powerful ideas in all of Hill's work on achievement, stripped of the language he used and stated plainly. Every successful completion of a committed action is a deposit into an account that your brain draws on when deciding whether to begin the next one. The account is not metaphorical. It is neurological. Your prefrontal cortex, the part of the brain responsible for goal-directed behavior and long-term decision-making, is more willing to initiate difficult actions when it has a recent history of successful completions to draw on. Conversely, when the history is one of starting and stopping, the initiation threshold rises. The brain needs more convincing to begin, because beginning has historically not led to finishing. Evidence banking means you treat every small completed action as currency. Not just the visible outcomes, the pound lost, the dollar saved, the page written. The completion itself. The fact that you said you would do something and you did it. That the version of you who made the commitment and the version of you who followed through were the same person on the same day, regardless of how it felt. Most people discount this. They'll do the small action and immediately shift focus to how far they still have to go. How much the small action doesn't matter in the context of the total distance. How someone else would have done more. They spend the evidence the moment it's deposited. Evidence banking requires a different internal move. Receiving the completion. Pausing long enough to register without external celebration. Without performance that you said you would and you did. That the ledger has a new entry. That the prediction is 1 vote closer to changing. This is not self-congratulation. It is calibration. It is your nervous system receiving accurate information about what kind of person is operating it. But evidence banking has a dependency. It only produces the change we're describing if the actions being banked are real commitments, things you said you'd do and did, not things you did spontaneously and are now retroactively counting. The brain knows the difference. Spontaneous action builds no prediction because there was no commitment to test against. The evidence that matters is the evidence of integrity, alignment between what you said and what you did, which connects directly to the third principle. The third principle is the commitment gradient. One of the most common ways that well-intentioned people accidentally reinforce motivational dependency is by making commitments that are sized for their best days instead of their worst. You commit to working out 6 days a week when you're feeling the fire. 6 days a week is achievable on your best day. It is not achievable on the day after a terrible night's sleep, a hard conversation, a work crisis that bleeds into the evening. And so on your worst day, you skip. And skipping tells the brain that the commitment was conditional. Conditional on feeling good. Conditional on conditions cooperating. The commitment gradient means you make commitment size for your worst days, not your best days. And then this is the part people miss: you always do more than the commitment when conditions allow. Not because the commitment wasn't good enough, because exceeding the commitment is how you build evidence of capacity without making reliability contingent on capacity. On your worst day, you do the minimum, and it counts. On your best day, you do more, and it also counts. Both entries go into the ledger. Both update the prediction. But neither day breaks the streak, because the commitment was always set at the level the worst day can sustain. This is not lowering your standards. This is protecting your reliability, which is worth more than your standards over any meaningful time horizon. A person who reliably does 3 modest things outperforms a person who occasionally does extraordinary things and regularly does nothing. Hill's language for this was the persistence principle, the idea that steady, consistent motion toward a specific end eventually overcomes every obstacle, not because the person is pushing harder, but because they have not stopped. The stopping is what most people do. The not stopping, at whatever pace the worst day allows, is the mechanism. But there is a gap between the commitment, gradient, and actual results that most people fall into. And it's the gap that produces the most frustration, because you're doing everything right and the evidence of progress is still invisible. The fourth principle addresses that gap directly. The fourth principle is the lag acknowledgement. Every meaningful outcome lags its behavioral cause. The body that reflects the training starts showing up months after the training begins. The financial foundation that reflects consistent saving starts feeling real a year after the habit was established. The creative skill that reflects daily practice becomes visible to others long after it becomes visible to you in private. Most people intellectually understand this. Almost no one emotionally lives with it. Because intellectually understanding the lag means nothing to the part of your brain that evaluates risk and reward in real time. That part of your brain does a cost-benefit calculation every single day. It sees the cost clearly: effort, discomfort, time, the sustained low-grade inconvenience of doing a thing when you don't feel like it. And it looks for the benefit to weigh against the cost. When the benefit is invisible because of the lag, the calculation fails. The cost is real and present. The benefit is invisible and theoretical. And so the brain, doing exactly what brains do, starts to flag the behavior as potentially pointless. That is the moment most people stop. Not because they're wrong that the results aren't visible. They're not visible yet. The lag is real. But stopping at the lag is the specific error that keeps the results perpetually delayed. Because every time you stop at the lag, you reset the clock on the lag. You never get past it. The results remain perpetually theoretical because the behavior never runs long enough for them to become actual. Lag acknowledgement means building an internal protocol for the lag period, not a motivational frame, not a positive spin. A clear, honest acknowledgement: I am in the lag. The results are not visible. The results are also not absent. They are accumulating in ways that are currently unmeasurable. My job during the lag is to protect the behavior from my evaluation of its results. The mental shift is separating the behavior from the outcome in your daily evaluation. You evaluate whether you did the behavior. You do not evaluate whether the behavior is working yet. The working is not yet your business. The doing is. This is one of the hardest cognitive disciplines in all of personal development. Not because it's complicated, because it requires trusting a process in the absence of visible evidence, and trusting things you can't see is something the scarcity-minded brain finds genuinely threatening. Which is why the fifth principle is the one that holds all the others together. The fifth principle is the identity anchor. Not an identity declaration, an identity anchor. The difference is foundational. A declaration says, I am this kind of person. It asserts a conclusion in advance of the evidence. An anchor says, the evidence I am building points toward this kind of person. It creates a forward orientation without overstepping what the evidence currently supports. The anchor functions like this, at regular intervals, weekly, not daily, because daily evaluation is too granular to show meaningful change. You look at the evidence you've accumulated, not your outcomes, your completions, the actual data of what you said you do and what you did, and you let that data tell you something specific about the direction of your identity. Not, I am someone who always follows through. That's a declaration you can't honestly make yet. But, I am someone who has followed through more often this week than last week. That's an anchor. It's accurate, it's evidence-based, and it points forward. Over time, the anchor migrates. More often this week becomes consistently for the past month. Consistently for the past month becomes reliably for the past year. And somewhere in that migration, the prediction updates. The ledger tips. The identity stops being something you're working toward and becomes something you're working from. That is the shift. That is the moment the force becomes self-sustaining. Not because motivation returned, because identity solidified. And here's what that feels like from the inside, because most people don't recognize it when it arrives. It doesn't feel like a revelation. It doesn't feel like a breakthrough. It feels quiet. It feels like doing the behavior on a day when you have every legitimate reason not to, and noticing that the internal negotiation is shorter than it used to be. It feels like the gap between intention and action shrinking, not to zero, but to a distance you can bridge without drama. It feels like being slightly but unmistakably different from the person you were 6 months ago. Not transformed. Shifted. And the shift, once it's real, compounds. Now comes the part they leave out of every success story. The part where awareness becomes its own enemy. Because you've been reading this, and something in you recognizes it. You can feel the logic of it settling in, making sense, connecting to your own experience in specific and uncomfortable ways. You feel, right now, something that resembles readiness. Something that might be the spark of a new beginning, and the old self is already mobilizing against it. Not dramatically, quietly. It sounds like, this is good, but my situation is different. It sounds like, I understand this now, so I should probably plan better before I start. It sounds like, I've felt this before at the end of a good video, and 6 weeks later I was back where I started. So maybe I should wait until I'm really sure this time. You will feel the resistance as wisdom, as maturity, as learning from past mistakes. And it will sound so reasonable that arguing with it will feel unreasonable. That is the most sophisticated move your old identity makes. It doesn't show up as laziness you can fight, it shows up as logic you can't easily refute. Here is what you need to understand about this resistance. It is not a signal to proceed with caution. It is a signal to proceed immediately, because the resistance is generated by the gap between your old identity and your new behavior. And that gap only closes one way, through the behavior. Not through thinking about the behavior more carefully. Not through planning the behavior more thoroughly. Through doing it. Now, before the resistance convinces you otherwise. The old identity is not your enemy. It is a structure that served you once. It kept you safe in a season when safety was the primary requirement. It is fighting now because it doesn't know that the season changed. It is protecting you from a threat that no longer exists. You do not argue with it. You do not defeat it. You act in the presence of it. You let it narrate while you move anyway. And every time you move while it narrates, it loses a little authority. Not forever, not permanently, but for today it loses. And today is all that matters, because today is where the evidence gets made. There will be specific moments that test this principle harder than anything I can describe here. The moment 2 weeks in, when the results still aren't visible, and a voice tells you that this time is the same as every other time. The moment a setback, a skipped day, a financial stumble, a lapse in the discipline triggers the familiar cascade of self-blame and hopelessness. The moment someone in your life, intentionally or not, says something that confirms the old identity, and you feel the pull of it like gravity. In every one of those moments, you are going to feel like the situation calls for reflection, recalibration, maybe a fresh start. It doesn't. It calls for the minimum viable action, the smallest version of the committed behavior, not recalibration continuation, not a fresh start, the next step in the sequence that was already underway. A missed day does not reset your streak to zero. It adds one imperfect day to a record of mostly consistent days. The brain updates predictions based on overall patterns, not individual events. One skipped workout does not make you someone who doesn't work out. One overspent week does not make you someone who can't save. One bad chapter does not make you someone who can't write. Only stopping makes you someone who stopped. And stopping at this point is a specific decision. Not a default, not an inevitability, a choice. And you get to make it consciously, with full awareness of what you're choosing and what you're walking away from. Let me describe who you're becoming. Not the outcome version, the internal version, the one that matters before any external result arrives. You are becoming someone who trusts themselves, not in the grandiose, inspirational sense, in the specific, earned, evidence-based sense of someone who has made small commitments and kept them consistently enough that the gap between what they say and what they do has measurably closed. That trust changes everything downstream. It changes how you evaluate opportunities, because you are no longer evaluating them through the lens of a person who has historically not followed through. When an opportunity requires sustained effort over an uncertain time horizon, you don't automatically assume you'll collapse before the payoff. You have evidence that you don't. The calculation is different. It changes how you relate to failure, because you are now a person who has continued through failure, through missed days and imperfect weeks and disappointing results that came slower than expected. Failure is no longer a verdict. It is a data point. And data points, unlike verdicts, don't end things. They inform the next move. It changes how you set goals, because you've stopped setting goals based on what sounds good and started setting them based on what you've demonstrated you can actually sustain, which means the goals you set are goals you reach. And reaching goals is its own compounding force, because each reached goal raises what your nervous system believes is possible for you. It changes how you experience time. The person who is dependent on motivation experiences time as the enemy. The distance between now and the desired result is always too long, always a source of discouragement. The person who has shifted identity experiences time as the mechanism. Every passing day of consistent action is a day of compounding. The distance is not a problem, it is the process. And here's the thing about that internal architecture, that specific configuration of trust and patience and evidence-based identity that no one outside you can see. It doesn't announce itself. You don't become the kind of person who talks about discipline or posts about consistency or performs their growth for an audience. The people who talk most about their discipline are usually the people who have the least of it, because talking about it is a substitute for building it. The person on the other side of this shift is quiet. They do the work without narrating it. They don't need external acknowledgement for the internal evidence to count. They've stopped living for the moments that look like transformation and started building through the long, invisible stretches of ordinary, consistent action. They are, from the outside, unremarkable. They wake up, they do the minimum, they bank the evidence, they move through the lag without collapsing, they adjust without quitting, they continue. And slowly, then suddenly, the way compound interest works, They are somewhere that looks from the outside like they got lucky, like it came easily, like they were just built differently. They weren't. They just stopped building on sand. Here's where I leave you. Not with encouragement, with a question you need to answer before this video ends. Because right now you have two selves in the room with you. One of them is the person who has been building an identity out of good intentions, genuine effort, and repeated cycles of hope and collapse. The person who is smart enough to understand exactly what went wrong and why, and who has understood it multiple times before, in multiple videos, in multiple seasons of starting over. That person is skilled at understanding. That person is not yet skilled at continuing. The other is the person who is one small action away from a different entry in the ledger. Not a transformed person, not a disciplined superhuman, just someone who did the thing on the day they didn't feel like doing it. One vote, one entry. One small, unsexy, non-photogenic act of doing what was committed to in the face of complete emotional indifference. Both of those people are you right now. In 10 minutes, you will have chosen between them. Not by making a big decision, by making or not making a small one, by doing the minimum viable action you know you've been deferring, or by watching another video, reading another article, making another plan, and collecting one more day of evidence that you are someone who prepares to act instead of acting. The gap between where you are and where you want to be is not closed by understanding it. It is closed by one small action, repeated past the point where it feels meaningful. That point is not dramatic. That point will not be photographed. It will happen in a room alone, probably at a time that feels wrong, probably when the conditions are not ideal, probably with the narration of your old identity running in the background telling you this particular moment doesn't count. It counts. Every time it counts. If you're done waiting for the right feeling, say so. One word in the comments. The commitment to yourself lives in that one word more than in anything you've planned. And if this is the content that treats you like the intelligent, capable person you actually are, you know what to do.